Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Zoom. This is a 2015-2016 film, depending on what your search engine will tell you. This movie is currently at the second of this recording on a app called Tubi. Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service that at the end of the day, you can say that you've finally seen this movie and checked it out. Really, I would say the most fascinating and or interesting thing about this movie is we end up having three stories within one film, and really we end up also finding out that seemingly that every bit of these three stories are very much intertwined with one another, and really we have it to where there's a story about a story about a story, and that's what gets me really fascinated and or intrigued with this film. We end up having me also needing to desperately try and skirt around some things within this movie as well, because there is also some adult content within this movie. There are at points in time where we really have to have a person who takes on a job in a adult like doll factory, and it seems that we also at some points have some points in times where we have a bedroom business active sorts going on a beach, let's just say, and also we have it to where the premise of this movie is that a woman is to go and get plastic surgery done for her chest because she does not think that she has big enough melons. So she ends up getting surgery done upon her chest, and that all plays out. We also seemingly have a animated part of this movie where we end up having a character who is to be a person who is putting together a movie. It seems like he wrote it and he is directing it, and it seems that he is trying to smooth over the person who is to take control of this film, who is to let Edward do what he wants. And we end up having Edward who ends up trying to smooth this lady over by basically sleeping with her to have her be won over by this guy to otherwise have him do whatever he wants with this film, and so on and so forth. We also have a girl or woman named Michelle, and so this woman otherwise decides that she needs to leave her husband to pursue being a novelist. This girl originally was a model, and now bizarrely she decides to take it upon herself to be a writer, a novelist. And we end up having that this story is getting adjusted and or changed, as well as it seemingly is per every single one of these stories eventually has to get adjusted and has to get changed because of a reason which I will eventually get into once we get into spoilers. I honestly just think that this movie is really just fun. Coincidentally, I just so happened to realize that the guy who had played Battlestar in Falcon and Winter Soldier is actually in this movie. It wasn't me trying to purposely find a movie where any number of these people were in it. It was just purely a coincidence. And so, with that said, like I was just like, oh my god, like this guy was actually in this movie, and I didn't even realize it. That's great. It was great that I just stumbled upon that and was able to just get this uh, get this person within this movie. I guess not me purposely getting like, hey, I got his big break. No, like it's good that I just found this and just so happened to see that character there. We also have Tyler Labine or Tyler Labine. who I have seen in several things, shows like Reaper or reasonably shows like Deadbeat and plenty of shows like that that I've thoroughly actually enjoyed. The character who actually plays Bob in this film, and so hence why I wanted to really talk about this film again, because I had previously reviewed this in some other channel, but really that review went nowhere because people probably didn't understand what this movie was, and really, I still don't think that people will probably uh, have this review matter to them, but I don't know. I just thought that this movie was very different. There's a lot of different kind of things going on with this movie, and that's what makes me really intrigued about it. How we have like an live action story going on with an animated story going on, and then there's also another story that is going on, and they're like all of these stories are all commingled together. So, with that said, yeah, like basically, I'm gonna just go into spoilers because who knows if anybody's really interested in this movie. I find this movie to just be fun, just because this movie is wildly different than anything that I'm used to seeing, and so that's why I thoroughly will go back to it and eventually watch it at some point in time, just because I find this movie to feel like a one of a kind film that I want to go out of my way to check this out from time to time. It's a very interesting film. So, let's go into that double five to otherwise say that it's about that time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I can spoil this movie. One day I'm probably never going to do the whole like hand gesture thing, and eventually someone is like, "Well, where's the hand gesture? What happened? I'm used to the hand gestures. Like, why haven't you done that now?" And I'm like, "Well, anyways, some people may like it, some people may hate it, some people like get on with the review, and that's what I'll do for you." So, spoilers. So really I have to kind of do this in a bizarre like way because there's so many stories going on. More than likely I might have to like start one story, put a pen in it, and then go to another story and then put a pen in that and then go into another story and then like kind of reset, go back into like a certain portion of this film, and more than likely what I might have to do is I might just have to focus on one character and then kind of go around and stop at some point to tell someone's story, but then keep making that one person important. I'm trying to figure out how to exactly review this because it's fairly hard with three different stories that commingle through the story. So we end up having a woman named Emma. Emma Boyles sounds weird. So we end up having a character named Emma, who is to be seemingly in some adult doll factory. I say that just because we end up having these dolls that are of course to have lonely men or even women purchase them and use them for bedroom business like acts of sorts. And so that's why I thought that this movie was really interesting because of how vastly different it is compared to everything else. We have certain stories where it really, uh, like a Lars and the Real Girl, or even the Quibi show Dummy, where we end up having a love doll, I guess, being put into those stories, where really these adult dolls are used as just kind of kind of background like uh, imageries of sorts. And eventually, we end up having one doll eventually coming into this story. But we'll get to that. So we end up having both Emma and Bob going at it during their lunch break. It seems like they are having a very good relationship together. It seems that Bob um, really does think that Emma is attractive, and we end up having it to where Emma is like, you know what? Like, I am really wanting to increase my bust size, let's just say. And so we end up having Emma, who ends up drawing herself and drawing her in the way of which that she wants to see herself. And we end up having Bob, who is looking at this photo, and he's like, "Oh, is that you?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, like, I don't know, like I'm not sure if you should like look like this kind of girl. Like, I think how you look is fine. Like, I don't know, like, I think that and Emma is just like, well, like, that's how I want to look. And we end up having it to where Bob is like, well, I don't think that that's exactly my ideal girl. Like, I don't think uh, this and that. Like, I think that uh, this and that. And so we end up having Emma, who is just kind of like frustrated by the comment of Bob. And so we end up having Emma, who ends up artistically drawing the guy of which that she has a guy of her dreams fantasy about, to where she imagines who would she want to be with. And so she ends up drawing a guy named Edward Deacon. And so we end up having Emma, who ends up showcasing this to Bob, and Bob ends up kind of really shunning this guy and basically saying, like, well, like, he looks too generic. He looks too, uh, he looks too like a high end person, and I'm sure he'll never like look at you kind of twice. And so, because we end up having Emma, who ends up drawing this guy as him being this movie writer, who is of course like a movie writer, director, all kinds of things, and is seemingly a part of some movie. So I guess now we can start to put a pen into Emma. So we end up having Emma writing a story for Edward. So we end up finding out that Edward is seemingly putting together this movie, and it seems that Edward eventually needs an extension. So we end up having it to where Edward needs to go to a woman named Marissa to try and smooth her over, which basically means he needs to sleep with her to try and get the extension upon his film. Because we end up having Edward, who kind of knows exactly where he wants his story to go. And so we end up having it to where Edward is trying to sleep with this woman to try to get this film extended. And so uh, we end up having Edward, who is talking to a guy named Horowitz, which I believe is his assistant director. And so we end up having Edward, who is to talk about whether or not uh, this film is going to get extended. And so we eventually have it to where Emma is to go off on her own and eventually get her bust line adjusted. And so she ends up going to a plastic surgeon. And so we end up having Emma, who ends up deciding to get a bust adjusted. So we end up having this plastic surgeon looking over a picture that she had drawn of herself. And so this plastic surgeon said, okay, well, if you want to look like this photo, you're going to need this size. And so we end up having Emma, who ends up going through this surgery and eventually ends up realizing that it seems that there is a ton of people that seem to have liked the new Emma, and she ends up posting a photo of her new self, let's just say, on a Facebook or social media of sorts, and everybody's just bombarding it with likes. And there's a couple of comments like suggesting, "Did you?" And like this and that. And we end up having Emma who ends up deleting some comments and so on and so forth. Uh, some people end up saying "wow" or "gorgeous" or some other generic comment, which I kind of wonder if any of the social media people were actually like part of the actual staff, that they kind of went on there and just kind of like put their names on there. So maybe there's like a little hidden thing that you didn't know or something along those lines. So we end up having it to where Emma eventually is starting to realize that people are starting to look at her differently. There's guys that are otherwise catcalling her. We end up having at some points guys or whoever, people are just kind of staring at her, gawking at her, whichever. And so Emma is just going, like, I don't like this. We end up having at some point Emma ends up again going to work to sleep with her to sleep with her boy Bob, and during a lunch break yet again. And we end up having Bob, who is like, well, like, your chest is fantastic, but like it also makes me think like I am just uh like doing it with one of the dolls that are here. Like, and I feel like I'm like not doing it with you, I'm just doing it with one of the dolls. It's like there is no real true difference. And so Emma is just like, like, God, like, I thought that like me getting this done would make me like look attractive to everyone, and I would this and that, and I would feel better about myself. But if anything, this is just giving me the opposite effect. Like I'm just kind of like feeling regretful about all this. So we end up having Emma going back to her plastic surgeon and trying to tell this surgeon that that Emma wants to have her chest reduced to what she was before. We end up having this plastic surgeon telling her, it's like, well, like, are you sure? Because, like, you look amazing. And we end up having the plastic surgeon's doctor or like a assistant coming in to confirm that this girl does look amazing. And we end up having this doctor trying to prevent Emma from getting her chest removed or reduced or whatever. And so we end up having we end up having Emma like decide, well, no, I want this removed. And so we end up having the doctor who's like, well, here's the thing. The cost for the procedure to get these removed is going to cost the exact same as doing the procedure before, like putting them in and taking them out. It's going to cost the same. And so reasonably, like, we have it to where Emma's like, well, like, I was gonna buy a condo before, and like now I even have to put in more money to get these removed, and where am I gonna get the money? So we end up having it to where Emma seemingly is living next door to a personal trainer. This personal trainer seems to be on TV. He does commercials, and this personal trainer is actually the guy who plays Battlestar in Falcon and Winter Soldier at this time. So we end up having Emma, who ends up getting a mix-up in the mail, and it seems that she ends up getting this guy's mail, and it seems to be two dumbbells. And we end up having Emma, who ends up noticing that these dumbbells seem to have drugs inside of them. And so we end up having Emma talking to Bob, and they are like, well, what are we going to do with these drugs? Like, how about we try to, like, sell them to some drug dealer somewhere? But how are we going to be able to do that? Because I don't think we know anybody that is a drug dealer. And so we end up having the story bizarrely adjust now because Bob, who didn't know anybody who was a drug dealer before, now all of a sudden is having a prison tattoo upon his arm, and now he is familiar with somebody who he had been to prison with, and so we have it to where Bob can easily figure out uh, who to give these drugs to. And so Emma's like, oh, great. Well, then, if anything, with this exchange of money, then I should be able to do my procedure again and be able to, like, probably make enough money to do any number of things. So we end up having these people decide to try and take these drugs and uh, and put them in one of uh, these love dolls. It seems that also we have some man who is just called the Mustache Guy coming into this facility and wanting a certain woman to be built. A woman built to his specifications. He also wanted to go and have some kind of tour of this facility because he just wants to know how exactly all of these things are made and done and whatever. And so we end up having Emma going like, well, we don't exactly do that, but like, what do you want? And so this guy ends up like telling them exactly like what he needs because he had a girl that I guess had ran out on him uh, with some personal trainer, and so we end up having this guy wanting to get back the girl that he had lost, and so we end up having Emma and Bob putting drugs into this love doll, I guess, to uh, try and not have these drugs just lying around, to eventually have this doll being sent to this drug dealer, but it ends up that it was sent by mistake to the Mustache Guy. So we end up having both Emma and Bob having to break into this guy's home while he's making love to this doll to try to get these drugs out of this doll's mouth and or whichever hole-ish like place of which that they had put these drugs in this doll. So eventually they end up having to forcibly, while the mustache guy is going to uh, bring this doll into the tub with him, we end up having Emma ripping the head off of this doll and running with it because the drugs are actually in this doll's mouth. So we end up. Oh, and here's the thing. While Emma, I'm going to have to put a pen in that for a second. While Emma had felt very subconscious about her body and was really upset about the reaction of people when eventually she had her bust adjusted, we end up having Emma who ends up diminishing uh, Edwards. I said his last name. We have Emma who basically changes Edwards' Johnson size, his Schwanz size, his dang-a-lang. She ends up adjusting his stick size because reasonably, since this guy has such a wonderful life and everything is going so well for him, we end up having it to where Emma being bitter about how Edward's life is going so well, she ends up going and changing his Johnson size. And so we end up having Edward, who is to go out clubbing and seemingly doing some drugs with two women. And so we end up having Edward, who ends up deciding to go to bed with these two women. And so Emma adjusts Edward's Johnson size to where he feels like he cannot perform with these two women. And so he ends up going, well, like, wait a minute, like, hey, maybe we should just be friends, or maybe we should just go to sleep, or maybe we should just, like, get together some other time. And so these women are realizing that this guy is just going to blow them off. And so we end up having it to where Edward is now freaking out because his whole thing is that he needs to win over certain women in this business. He needs to sleep with them to get to the top, kind of thing, or sleep with them to be able to uh, get his movie to either be extended or have added scenes or something along those lines. And so we have Edward, who cannot perform. He ends up going to a doctor to see what the doctor will tell him, and that doctor actually ends up being the same plastic surgeon that Emma had seen earlier. So we end up having Edward, who has to forcibly now go to a certain sex shop and go and buy himself a Johnson extender to where it looks like his dangling is a little bit bigger, and to where he can go and satisfy these two women that he had been with earlier on in the movie. And then we end up having it to where it seems that Edward notices that this extender that Edward had on his Johnson ends up malfunctioning, so it doesn't quite work. So he's like, dude, I could have been injured, I could have been hurt, I could have been whatever. Because he ends up calling the manufacturer, and they're just like, well, like, there's no refunds, there's no returns. And so we end up having Edward, who is now just like, oh my god, like, what am I gonna do? Because we end up having Edward, who is to go and showcase this movie he is working on to this girl named Marissa, and she does not like the ending. Because Edward's story is actually Michelle's story. Michelle is a model who ends up deciding one day to become a novelist, and we end up having a character called Dale, who ends up telling her, it's like, dude, like, you're a model, like, do what you do best, be a model. And so we end up having Michelle, who ends up leaving Dale because Dale ends up telling her, it's like, dude, can you even spell anything in English? Like, can you even, like, know how to write a story? And so we end up having Michelle, who ends up writing him a note saying, like, oh, like, is this spelled correctly? I'm leaving you. And so we end up having Michelle ending up going and going off to find herself. And also it seems that she ends up bumping into a woman along the way, and it seems like this woman ends up taking off all of her clothes and going skinny dipping into this waters to really tell Michelle that she needs to loosen up, and maybe her being able to kind of loosen up will be able to help her write. We end up having it to where eventually, somewhere in these scenes, we end up eventually having Michelle at some point having some bizarrish kind of dream where it seems that she ends up seeing her parents making love by some side of a beach. And so we end up having Michelle after that deciding to jump off a ledge to die. But we end up having Edward who decides, well, that's not the way I want, like, we end up having Edward deciding that's the way I want this story to end. And we end up having his co director saying, like, well, you know what? Like, Marissa doesn't really like this ending. If anything, like, the story doesn't seem all good and all well and whatever. And so we have to try to jazz up this story a little bit more. We need to have more action in this movie. And so we need to, like, and this movie is actually Michelle's life. And so we end up having it to where Edward is to need to have to seduce Marissa to win her over to do these new scenes, to do this adjusted script. And so we end up having Edward who refuses to sleep with Marissa. And so we eventually have it to where we end up having Edward's co-director just taking upon himself to add a lot more scenes in here, to where we have Michelle who ends up re-meeting up with Dale, and Dale tells her, it's like, you gotta snap out of this, like, you gotta come with me onto this helicopter, and we gotta go back home. To where we end up having Michelle, who is eventually going to realize that something is going on with this story. So, back to Emma. So, we end up having Emma, who ends up going to her adult doll factory, and we end up having her eventually being confronted via the mustached guy and the personal trainer, and so we end up having this almost gun pointing like scenario. We end up having Bob, who also has a gun pointed at these three people, and we end up having Emma, who is to go and eventually realize, because Deacon realizes, and then eventually Deacon has to help Michelle understand that both Emma, Edward, and Michelle are all tied into one big story, and if one character exists, they all exist, kind of thing. And so we end up finding out that it seems that Michelle is actually writing Emma's story, and Emma is writing Edward's story, and we have it to where Michelle is writing how both Emma and Deacon are going, and we end up having Deacon who is writing Michelle's story. So, like, every bit of this is all entwined with one another, and we didn't realize it till fairly late in the film. And so we end up having it to where, because of all the rewrites of Michelle's story, we end up having Michelle who has Dale in this helicopter, and Dale is to take her book and to go and chuck it out of the helicopter, to where Edward is yelling to Michelle in camera that she needs to go and scramble to get this book to write them out of this story, because if she destroys the book, she ends up not only destroying her life, but she ends up destroying also Emma's life and also Edward's life. And we end up having it to where also Edward ends up communicating with Emma to let her know, like, well, what the F, man? Like, why did you uh, why did you shrink my Johnson? Why did you shrink my dingaling? Like, do you think this is funny? Like, do you, like, is this a joke to you? Is my life a joke? And we end up having Emma, who ends up writing into her comic book telling Edward to shut up. And so we end up having Edward, who ends up grabbing the cue card or whatever that ends up saying shut up, and he ends up breaking it in half and tossing it into the ground. And so Emma's like, what the heck is going on? Like, this makes no sense. And so we end up having Emma, who realizes that, like, her story is incorporated in all of these other stories. So eventually we end up having Emma, who ends up trying to write uh, to Michelle about what is going on with Michelle. And so Michelle realizes that she is actually inside of her story, and she didn't realize it until she just started writing it. And so Dale throws the book out, and so we end up having Michelle, who ends up diving for the book. She jumps out of the helicopter and dives for this book. So we end up having Michelle, who is falling for this book, and she is to grab the book and write into the book that everyone is to wake up. And so we end up having seemingly Edward taking control of this film to try and finish it, and we end up having Emma, who has eventually a shootout going on that ends up having everyone kind of shoot one another, and eventually there is a bullet that ends up going into Emma's bust, and so Emma ends up having her entire chest diffuse back to seemingly her normal chest size, and it seems that that is the way of which that it seems that this story is going to end, to where we end up seeing that Emma ends up leaking a bit of liquid that ends up on some of the guys, and also ends up on some of her sketches, where when Emma is trying to clean off some of the sketches, it ends up kind of ruining the image of Edward and all the people that are in the movie, to the point of it like basically ruining some of the characters. And so Edward ends up trying to adjust his existence, or tries to be able to figure out how he can like still live and stand and whatever within these pages. And so really that's just how the movie all just finishes out and dissolves. So with that said, yeah, very interesting movie, but I think that's all that I had to say about this movie. It's like a really kind of different kind of approach to this movie. And so, but yeah, we end up having Deacon, or we end up having Edward, who ends up having Emma at the last minute adjusting his Johnson size, to where we end up having Edward, who can end up satisfying Marissa, to where Edward can control the movie to be able to control how it ends. And so, like, that moment was, I guess, the most important moment of this movie, to where Marissa ends up saying to everybody, like, yep, he has control no matter what happens. He has control of this movie now because he had control over my loins. So, with that said, I think that's all that I had to say about this movie. And yeah, like, I probably could have mentioned a number of other things, but I also kind of wanted to get this review done as quickly as possible. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.